Connor is a case study in the understanding that American Indians are not a monolith, and to look back on them and lump them all together and assume that they all held the same views or opinions or anything is just incorrect. And so you've got to look at certainly each tribe and each culture and even each individual, and learn about them and what they did and why they chose to do it. I think there's, I think it's human nature, although I think it's exacerbated at the moment, to kind of really want to take sides, to really want to only see it one way or another. And John's existence and his life and his legacy, debunk all that. That there were a whole lot of reasons that Indians chose to fight when they chose to fight. They chose to, sign treaties or get along or even work directly with them when they did those things. Again, as both, tribal decisions with treaties and stuff, and individual decisions like taking jobs as guides and translators and all that kind of stuff. It just shows you that, history is complex. History does not fall neatly into any of our modern or anybody in the futures or anybody in the past. You can't put it in a box like that. It's not going to neatly fit and say, American Indians were as diverse as the Europeans that came over. They weren't all the same. It's really, it's I don't know, intellectual disservice in a way, but that I don't mean to imply intent, but because it's communication is not always easy in describing something. So it's all of the people that were in North America or in the Americas, we refer to collectively as Indians. But like I say, that doesn't mean anything more than when we refer to Europeans, who are not all the same by any stretch and have been in war with each other for, ever, and then had alliances, and then were at war again, and then different people chose to work with different sides and at different places and times, and that's American history. And when I say American history, I don't mean U.S. history. I mean, I do agree that it's America, where this is the Americas, and everybody, either from here historically, from whatever point of time, to they come here and become Americans today, whether it's South America, North America, whatever, it's Americans. And American history is diverse. The people in the Americas are diverse. We were talking earlier about, the archaeology that's being learned, and that, we used to think they all came as part of one group at one particular time and then spread out across the Americas. Nope. Both archaeology and DNA are telling us that no, they came from different places, different times, different groups over thousands of years, and spread out across and led very different lives and had different cultures and developed completely different languages and religions and organizational practices, and you name it. And it wasn't a land of peace and harmony, nor was it a land of constant war either. It was just like Europe. Sometimes there was peace, sometimes there was war. Or China, Asia, and so on, Middle East, Africa. It's, human history is complex, and so that's what I hope that people take from this. They look at John Connor and say, this is a man who, in his place and time, where he came and from where he was raised. And that's a really thing, because, we talked about his father being, of mixed heritage, probably primarily European, but his mother was Indian. Well, the Delaware and other tribes, especially Algonquin tribes, were this way. They were matrilineal. Not unlike the Jewish culture. Your mother determines your identity and your place in the tribe. Doesn't matter who your father was, because they can't really prove who your father was anyway. So if you are raised, the way the Lenape did it is, if you were raised by a Lenape mother in the Lenape culture, you were a Lenape. And if you weren't, you weren't. And that's why there was a guy that eventually became chief of the Delaware in the late 19th century that was a usurper by the traditions. And he was not even, his mother had claimed to be a Delaware, but it looks like she might not even had been in Indian at all. But he became the chief, claiming, that he was a Delaware, but in fact he wasn't, and so he was, according to their traditions, he was a usurper. But he became dominant. He had been Christianized, and there was, that's the thing when you look at the Delaware and other tribes, there ended up being splits because some converted and others did not. Connor is falsely accused by Westlager, who wrote the big history of the Delaware, of being a traditionalist. He actually was baptized, but he was sympathetic to the Delaware traditionalists. He didn't want to suppress them in practicing their traditional religion. But Westlager was very much tied to this usurper in his family, and even printed some other false things about Connor, like a name. I'm here to talk to you tonight about Chief John Connor, Delaware chief, who was the only Indian to get a land grant in Texas. And that's significant because in the Republic of Texas and the early state constitutions, land grants were restricted only to people of exclusively European heritage. Not people of Indian heritage or African heritage were not allowed to receive land grants. And there were two exceptions in our history to that rule. One was a mixed-race African-American man who was a soldier in the Texas Revolution, and he received a land grant. And then there was John Connor, the Delaware chief. John's Lenape or Delaware name has been lost to history, unfortunately. The story is available in this book, Single Star of the West. The Republic of Texas, 1836 to, well, they said 1845, but it didn't actually transition the governments until February of 1846. There's a chapter here. This is an anthology, so there's different authors in here. But in here, I talk about John Connor and what he did. And the synopsis of that is he was working during the second Houston administration as an emissary, as an ambassador to the Comanches and the Kiowa primarily, in the wake of the Lamar. Lamar basically tried to run all of the Indians out of Texas. You kind of, went to war with all of them. And so tensions were high when Sam Houston came back into office. The Republic restricted, and there's some mistakes. Some of my very, prestigious colleagues have been in error when talking about this period, because sometimes don't understand the complexities of the politics and the law surrounding the transition of governments. And in the case of the Republic, the president in the Constitution was not allowed to succeed themselves. They could run for 2 terms, but they couldn't be back to back. So Howard Lamar was the president of Yale, a descendant of Mirabeau B. Lamar. Mirabeau B. Lamar did not defeat Sam Houston, though that's been written in certain widely distributed, prestigiously published history books. That's not what happened. Houston wasn't able to run against Lamar. Lamar and Houston never ran against each other. So Houston won in a landslide, then had to step aside for a term. Lamar ran. The first man who was lined up to run against him died. The second man who was lined up to run against him died. There's questions about the circumstances about both deaths. The third man comes in basically at the last minute. He's somebody nobody's ever heard of and has no time whatsoever to campaign. And remember, There's no technology. The only campaigning is getting on a horse and riding across Texas to town to town to town. So, so yes, Lamar won, and by a very substantial margin, because basically he had no opponent, realistically speaking. And also a thing about that some of my colleagues have mistaken about that is they try to then attribute his win to Texan attitudes towards Indians. The problem with that is that he didn't campaign on that at all. Now, when he was inaugurated, he gave a fiery anti-Indian speech, absolutely, and then he proceeded to go to war against them all. But he didn't campaign on that. And then when you put that together with, 2 years later, Houston comes back and wins again in a landslide, Texan attitudes towards Indians were a lot more complex and wide-ranging than some of my colleagues have given them credit for. But that's what some of them said, that because, and you see this, if you follow the historiography, you follow a series of books, you see where this mistake comes, because they cite back to the original thing. They say this one author wrote that Lamar succeeded Houston. That's true. He followed him in office. That's called succeeded. That's not the same. But then you eventually see people cite that source, but then they start saying defeated Houston. It's not what happened. And so Houston comes back, and obviously things are tense. Everybody is, and the Comanches have kind of withdrawn back further west into areas that no white man had ever been. And Houston really wants to make peace. And that was a key component of his platform and of his policy. But he knew he couldn't send an Anglo out into the hill country, at that point, because they'd have been killed before anybody had talked to them. Things were too tense. So he looked for an Indian emissary. And John Connor was no accident. He was no accidental find. He was a Lenape, a Delaware, and he was descended from the principal chiefs, and he eventually ascended to principal chief of the Delaware tribe. And the Delaware had a pre-Columbian history of being mediators between the Indian tribes. So before Europeans ever got here, they were called the grandfather tribe, the Lenape. The Algonquins especially were all descended from their original stock and spread out over northeastern America, southeastern Canada, so forth. And so they were respected warriors and so forth, and so they often served as mediators. And so they continued that role after Europeans arrived. And John Connor was following in that tradition. And he played this role, and it was a significant role when you look at it in the record. And this was the thing. This is really as interesting as the story itself is how it had been overlooked, but where I found it. Because Connor had been overlooked. And, there's some brief references to him in a couple of books that are out there prior to Single Star of the West. But they, at best, dismiss him as having been a translator or a guide. They don't understand that he was an emissary. But in the Texas Indian Papers from the state archives, he's all throughout there, and he had the authority to negotiate, and he signed treaties on behalf of the Texas government, both during Sam Houston's administration and beyond, including all the way up to the Moisabach Treaty. Have y'all heard about the Moisabach Treaty of the Germans and out of Fredericksburg and that sort of thing? It's a pretty famous treaty in Texas history. There's the original is in the Texas State Archives, sometimes put on display. And he signed that treaty, signed it with an X. He was illiterate, didn't read or write, but he spoke at least 6 languages. He spoke, obviously, in the Lenape. He spoke English, he spoke Spanish, he spoke several Indian languages, including Indian Sign. And obviously, those were key tools for a mediator. And one of the interesting things that kind of proved the significance of his role and Houston's trust in him was, in those Indian Papers, you see a gentleman whose name escapes me at the moment, and it really doesn't matter because he complains. He's an Anglo. He thinks that he's the boss out there in negotiating with these Comanches, and he is writing back to Austin complaining that this Indian dares to speak on behalf of the president and to make offers and engage in negotiations on behalf of the president, and kind of how dare he and how and so forth. And you see this. So there's this period of time where he's in the record doing this, and Connor's in the record. Now Connor never mentions this guy. Connor just writes back talking about, and somebody wrote for him, and he's X, and that's documented. But he communicates back, what he's doing, and that's all there. And all of a sudden, he disappears from the record. This Anglo guy that had been complaining about Connor, he just disappears, but Connor's still there for years. And but like I say, then and much later, my colleagues have kind of overlooked him because they get focused on conflicts, the conflicts between various tribes, and that's kind of how I came to this. Is I saw that as I was in grad school, and I was getting ready to start a class on Texas Indians with an award-winning scholar, Todd Smith, written especially on the Caddos and the Wichita and others. And I told Dr. Smith when I was, asking him to be able to take that class the following semester, I told him, I said, I feel like the conflicts have been done. They've been done a lot from the Anglo perspective, from the Indian perspective, various tribes, from the Spanish perspective, and so on. I think everybody tends to focus on the conflicts. I'd like to dig into, we see these little hints here and there about Indians that were collaborating and cooperating, serving with. There were Indian Texas Rangers long before the one that was sitting in this room. During the Republic, there were Tonkawas, there were Apaches and so forth that served as Texas Rangers, among others. And so that's what I wanted to look into. I was like, who exactly were these people, and why were they doing what they're doing when they did it? Why they make these choices. I'm very much about what they, talk about agency, both as individuals and as groups. Why did they do what they do and make those choices? And so Dr. Smith recommended me looking into the Delaware generally. He's like, he knew that the Delaware were here and were, got along very well with the Texans, and governments didn't really have a lot of conflicts. And it was only after the U.S. government took over that they were forced out of Texas, later under statehood, under the U.S. government authority, not under Texas or state authority. So I said, okay, I'll look into the Delaware. So then I was, a little bit later, I was at the state archives doing some dissertation research and visiting with Donnelly Bryce. If you've never heard of Donnelly Bryce, just look at any Texas history book from the last 50 years, and chances are his name is in the acknowledgments. He was with the state archives for decades and was just the most generous person with assistance. He was passionate about what he did and helping researchers find what they were looking for. So much so, and he published a few books himself as well. But he went so far as when he would be in the archives researching for somebody, looking for pulling some file, he would come across things, had nothing to do with whatever that person was looking for, but as a historian himself, he recognized that this when something was significant, and he's like, someday somebody's going to want this. So he kept this Rolodex. You remember the old paper Rolodex with the cards, and we put the phone numbers and stuff. Well, he had one of those, and he had phone numbers in it, but he also had tabs with notes of the stuff he had found over the years, so that if somebody ever came in asking about that, he would have it ready at hand, And so sure enough, when I said, I'm going to be researching the Delaware, he says, come with me. And we go to his office, and he pulls out that Rolodex, and he flips through, and he said, looky here. And it said, John Connor, Delaware chief, land grant, and a file number. I think that's about all that was on the card. And he goes and pulls this file for me, and it was a lawsuit that was filed decades after, about 20 years after Connor's death, over the land grant land that he had patented, but sold. He never really lived on the land. He patented it right before he left, when he had been called after his brother, who was principal chief, passed away, and he was called to succeed him as principal chief, and served in that role for the rest of his life. And but so the family, these descendants, and the district court judge, thankfully, and I say that because legally he should have dismissed the case. It had no grounds. It was a misunderstandings of how land grant law worked and the verbiage in it and things like that. But I'm thankful that he made that mistake, because if it would have stopped there would have been no record that would have survived in a county courthouse for a little case that had been filed and dismissed. We'd have nothing. We'd maybe never known about this. But it went to eventually the Court of Criminal Appeals. Obviously, the landowner, disagreed with the district courts and appealed and won on appeal. But because he appealed, then those records got preserved in the state archives and the records of the Supreme Court of Texas. And and that's why we have those records, and that's why they were discovered, because now there were other records, but nobody had ever come across them in the state archives, and those are the details on the legislation. Like I said, they had to pass a special act of the legislature. And in order to do that, because he had actually kind of waited a while, because he was very busy in Texas. He was, like, the last several years, he was living in Fredericksburg, next to Fort Martin Scott. There was a Delaware village nearby. And he was, busy, being a mediator and being an ambassador and being, and helping get peace treaties signed all over West Texas, or, well, what was then West Texas. And so he kind of at the last minute had to patent this land grant that he got and then sell it. And then he moved on back up to Kansas and then led the tribe down into Oklahoma, their final stage of their migration into Oklahoma, where they are, remain to this day. And in order to pass that legislation, they had to have supporting documents. They had to have affidavits that, verified what he had done and the role he had played and under what authority and so forth. And this then became the connection. Tom had contacted me originally about my most well-known work, East Texas Troubles. That was my dissertation and published as a book. And it's about Texas Rangers in the 1930s in San Augustine, Texas, but it's also about the creation of DPS and the politics surrounding that, which it all ties together. And so but then I think it went that Tom mentioned to me that Allen, Texas is named for Ebenezer Allen, who was, as I'm sure most of y'all know, the Attorney General for the Republic. And he either was Attorney General during statehood or some other state office.
Secretary of State during the Republic of Texas.
Okay. And so Ebenezer Allen was one of the people who wrote an affidavit in support of John Connor. And so they're going to put it up on the screen for you here. This is the affidavit from Ebenezer Allen, your town's namesake. It says, I have been requested by the friends of Mr. John Connor, a Delaware, whose application for that handwriting can get a little tough. League of land. Yeah, okay, so he did get a whole league, that's right. A league of land in compensation for his services under the late Republic has been referred to you to address you a few times in relation to his claim. It is with much diffidence, is that a word? That I submit this statement for your consideration, but a sense of duty impels me to do so, and respectfully to command to your enlightened, I'm not sure on that one, the justice and merits of this claim. The applicant was employed by General Houston as an interpreter, guide, and agent in opening negotiations, effecting treaties, and conducting conciliatory measures with the various Indian tribes then hostile to Texas. His familiarity with the language, customs, and peculiarities of the various tribes under his services, very important. They were rendered his services, I think, very important to the government, and fitted him for the difficult employment in which he was engaged. He continued in the service during a great portion of the years of 1842 and 43. His fidelity never was questioned, and the importance and value of his services were often hazardous and arduous, and were eventually admitted and acknowledged. There are many now living, and some at present in the capital, who can bear honorable testimony to the merits and great utility of his services. Among those, permit me to refer to Washington D. Miller, Esquire. Now, who knows who Washington D. Miller was? The secretary to Sam Houston. Wash Miller, often as referred to. The then private secretary to the executive. Before entering upon his public duties, Mr. Connor was promised by the president, on behalf of the Republic, a league of land as a reward for serving, which he engaged to perform, and to which he afterward is so faithfully accomplished. Being himself wholly unacquainted with the laws of this country, he regarded this promise from the executive as an unquestionable grant of the land, and as such confidently relied upon it. It rests with the legislature to redeem or repudiate the promise, but a sense of justice under the circumstances seems most imperatively to require its exact fulfillment. And I humbly conceive that this act of justice to a humble but well-known servant of the Republic, although the performance of a plain obligation will be followed by consequences of great public advantage. Please accept the affiance of my esteem, Ebenezer Allen. So he wrote that on behalf of John Connor, the Delaware chief. And John was, as we've established, in fact, awarded that grant. So, and you know, I don't know how much y'all know about the ledge. If any of y'all have been, I know Tom's got background in the political world. You know, getting anything through the legislature is quite an uphill battle. You know, something that I'm sure there were, you know, detractors. You know, some people who held singular views of Indians or what have you, or some that just didn't want to give land away. You know, that there's all kinds of reasons people might have opposed it, but it passed, and he was granted the land. Another interesting person that wrote this Indian chief a affidavit was Robert Baylor, who was not known for being a fan of Indians. Donnelly, introduced me to this, and then I just started doing more research. Of course, when I contacted the General Land Office, where the land grant records, well, of course, a gentleman who had been there 40 years at this point, long since retired, but he had been there 40 years, and when I called him and said, I need to pull the records for, John Connor, Delaware chief, land grant, he's like, oh, no, that didn't happen. It was against the Constitution. No Indian ever got a land grant. So again, these records, and I finally had to tell him, now pretty much everything they have is now digitized, but it was in process back then, and so these weren't digitized. But there was an online index that had a file number, and I finally had to just say, please go pull this file number for me. And sure enough, it was the land grant files for John Connor, Delaware chief. And I didn't say I told you so to his face or anything. But yeah, it's why we should never, as a historian, I don't like to kind of draw ultimatums with, the first, the last, the mostest, the bestest, the whatever. I always qualify those things, because it's as far as we know at the moment. So maybe, since we didn't know about John Connor, maybe there's another one out there. So that's the way it is. He's the only Indian to get a land grant that we know of. Sometimes people think they were the first, or something was the first, or the last, or whatever. What's that actress's name? There was a young actress who played in some action movies a few years ago that were very big. And she was being interviewed, and she said that she was the first female action star. And Sigourney Weaver, and and Wonder Woman, and lots of ladies beg to differ. So we it's one of the reasons history is important. We don't know what we don't know, and we'll never know everything. Some things are lost when somebody passes away. Some boxes in an attic get thrown out. Their memories were never recorded, so those are gone. We'll never know everything about any point in time in history, and so we should always be open to learning new things. They kind of call these untold and undertold stories, and definitely John Connor, his story fits in that, because multiple generations of historians coming from very different perspectives and points of view and angles and agendas have all overlooked John Connor until now. So I don't know where we are on time.
Take your time.
Okay. So Connor, what this did for me as a historian, as a graduate student at the time, is it answered a question. It's like, here's an example. Here is an Indian, a very prominent Indian from a prominent tribe in a prominent role, and he chose, and his tribe chose, because other members of his tribe participated. There was one. He was from the main band. He was born in Indiana. John Connor was. His father was mixed ethnicity, some Scots, some Irish, maybe some Indian, but his mother was Delaware Indian, or Lenape. And Lenapes were a matrilineal culture. They're traditional, and so that meant your status in the tribe, including being a member of the tribe, and your status and your rank to be able to ascend to certain levels, came from your mother. And so his mother was the daughter of the principal chief at the time, and he was born in Indiana. And when they moved from Indiana to Kansas, the tribe did. The Lenape, started in the Delaware Valley. That's where they, were going back further than we can possibly know. When Europeans arrived, and that's why the name Delaware stuck with them. But they were slowly moved into the Ohio Valley, and then into Indiana, then to Kansas, then to Oklahoma. And they always did so under treaty. They never made war against the British or the U.S. government, any of that. And the promises to them weren't always kept. But they never took a hostile position. They made their choices to collaborate and cooperate and so forth. And so they were moving at this particular time, and John was about 18, and his parents split up. The father decided to stay in Indiana. He had a property there. It's now a historic site called Conner Prairie. not all the information on their website is exactly accurate where John Connor is concerned, but that's because there wasn't a lot on him until this. And there was some misinformation. There was a historian named Westlogger that wrote a big history of the Delaware, and he said a lot of things about Connor that were demonstrably untrue. But so the father stays, remarries, has more kids. One of them gets named John. But this John Connor, the Delaware chief, he helps his mother move his siblings with the tribe, and then he goes on what you may have seen in Australian parlance is called a walkabout, and that is he started traveling all across North America. He headed out from Kansas to the Pacific Ocean, then went down through California, down all the way into Mexico City at least, up back through Texas and Louisiana and so on, and multiple times. The Lenape were not a horse culture. They were from the Northeast. They were not a horse culture. So he was on foot. He did all this traveling many, many times, covering North America on foot. And now they didn't walk and they didn't all out run. They moved at what was described as kind of a brisk trot. In fact, Jack Hayes, y'all know Jack Hayes, a famous Texas Ranger? Well, he and Connor were on an outing together. That's a kind of a tangent, but they were on an outing together and ended up off horseback. Even Hayes did, and some of his men, for some reason. And so he's having a hard time keeping up with Connor and the other Lenape. I mean, and he writes about it. He admits it in his memoir that he wrote, or maybe it was that Ford. Really, it was John Ford. He told it to John Ford, and John Ford wrote it. But he admitted it. He said, "Yeah, those guys, they have incredible stamina, and I didn't want to let them know I was struggling, but I was struggling." And so they could cover a lot of ground in a surprisingly short amount of time. And so many times, and he was so traveled that when he was living, in Fredericksburg, next to Fort Martin Scott, Colonel Dodge, there's a famous colonel, wrote a very famous memoir. What was his first name? Tom, do you remember Colonel Dodge's first name? Yeah, just Colonel Dodge. But it's you can still find it published. It's really an amazing. It's this colonel who had was in the American West as a U.S. soldier for decades, from being a very young man all the way up until he was probably older than me, and he said he met Connor, and he had spent a lot of time with Connor, and he said that Connor had more knowledge of the North American continent than any man alive at the time. And Dodge had met a lot of people, knew a lot of people. So he impressed, and that's some of the places where I found more information again. In Dodge's memoir, nobody had ever, and people have been reading Dodge's memoir for generations, but yet for some reason they chose never to mention what he says about Connor. And there were others. So, I kind of pieced together his story through this combination of these, legislative records and legal records and land grant records, but then these, and these affidavits and these memoirs of various people that crossed paths with him. He was out there, but he just, and Tom was asking me about, why I think he's overlooked, and I don't like to assume people's motives. So, there was a historian, a British historian, on a documentary I watched recently about the history of England, early history, and she made a point. Actually, it was about Vikings in England and France. And she made a very good point. It's like, we can't get inside people's heads, and we shouldn't. And some of my colleagues in recent years have kind of taken to trying to do that, and it's not really fair. So I don't know. I don't know why he's been overlooked, but he's been overlooked. And he was incredibly significant and served. I mean, you know, if he could not have brought peace, and if the Comanches and Kiowas and other tribes would have decided, you know, to go all out war, things may have gone a very different direction for Texas and thereby the West. You know, the most scholars and so forth will tell you that, you know, that when Texas became part of the United States, that opened up the West. Whether you think it's a good thing, a bad thing, whatever, it's a fact. You know, the Texas becoming part of the U.S. opened up the West. You know, they already had Louisiana. They bought that from France. And then when they got Texas, you know, that was that. And not everybody wanted that. Mirabeau Lamar didn't want to join the United States. He wanted to create a Texas republic all the way to California. And in fact, that's revolves around. So Jack Hayes, you know, y'all know about Jack Hayes, and there's, you know, he's known for being this famous Ranger commander and being one of the first that we know of to, there's that qualification again, to use the revolver, the Colt revolver in combat, and so forth. And then he ended up in California. Most, you know, people, if you've read anything about, you know, he ended up in California. He actually, because he was a surveyor by trade, that's what he was doing for paid work here, even in Texas. And then he went out to California, and he surveyed and laid out the town of Oakland and became the first sheriff in San Francisco and things like that. And so, but what a lot of people don't realize is he actually left Texas with his tail between his legs. He led an expedition to try to find a route to California in 1848. And that's the mission that Connor was on. But Connor wasn't hired by Hayes. Hayes had hired a guide from Mexico that he knew and he was listening to. And Connor had been brought along with Colonel Highsmith, who, and Hayes was not in this capacity. He was this expedition leader. He was not a ranger commander. And Highsmith was the ranger. He commanded a company of rangers that accompanied this trip as protection. And Connor was with them. And Hayes wouldn't listen to Connor. He was listening to this Mexican guide who got them incredibly lost. And one guy went crazy with starvation. People died. The whole group almost died. Highsmith finally broke off. He said, "I'm done. I'm leaving the Indians group." And Highsmith and Governor, blanking on his name. Terrible with names. But the governor at the time, they were very unhappy. And the governor was a former Ranger commander, and they were very disappointed in Hayes, and so he kind of took a job with the Army, you know, as a guide, and because he didn't even end up, you know, a lot of people think he went straight to California. They say, oh, it was 49, and he went to California for the gold rush. No, he was gone well before that, he was basically working as a guide for the Army for a long time, and eventually settled in California. So. Do you want to go to questions?
What's the picture?
Oh yeah, talk about the picture. So this picture, as I mentioned, Connor became the principal chief of the Delaware Nation, and this is him with his delegation in Washington D.C. one time. I think maybe 58, but I forget. But these are all Lenape chiefs. But Connor is right here in the center.
In the center, yeah.
That's John Connor. So he met, you know, as the Delaware chief. They were doing some kind of revision to their treaty and so forth, and had gone to Washington, you know, as the process happens. and so forth. So that's the only known photograph of him. And then if you want to flip to the other picture, that's a painting by, I believe it was George Catlin of Connor. So that would have been 20, 30 years earlier. And it's a painting, so, and it's, side profile. But it does accurately depict, he's described by others, the dress, the headpiece, that was a distinctive Lenape. And so there were others. There was a German biologist, and that wrote a book about Texas geography and geology and all this kind of stuff. And he misnamed Connor as Jim Shaw. I don't know if y'all have ever heard about Jim Shaw, but he's actually has a little higher profile, in the Texas record, and he was part of the Texas Delaware. When that split happened from Indiana, a group of the Delaware didn't go with the main band. They came down to Texas, and they were sometimes called the absentee Delaware or the Texas Delaware. And they are still kind of independent. They settled eventually in West Oklahoma, while the main band of the Lenape or Delaware settled in what's now Bartlesville. And so they had, Shaw was a Texas Delaware. So he had, by the time Connor comes here, he engaged Shaw as an assistant. Shaw was not a chief, so he would have been dressed differently. He looked different. He was much younger, and all of that. And that's why, that's my, as a historical deduction that this German writer misnamed him, because he said it. He called him Jim Shaw, but he described a much older man and that he was a chief and so forth. So there's others. There's you've already seen the letter. So so that's. There's another image that we believe is Shaw that was painted at one of the Comanche treaties with the Germans, and it wasn't finished. The painting itself was not completed. It's an incomplete painting, and we believe that the Indian, who's very similarly dressed, that it was John Connor, most likely. But he had children, and he had multiple, but that's not something I've done a lot of work on yet. But I do, I know that he was baptized a Christian, but he remained supportive and sympathetic to the traditional religion and those who wanted to continue practicing the traditional religion. That's where one of the conflicts in Westlauger's book comes in. Is he kind of claimed that that he was a traditionalist, and Westlauger was very much a sympathetic to the Christianized faction, and which eventually overtook. So under Lenape tradition and law, if you will, you had to be descended from a Delaware chief through your mother in order to become a chief. And he was. But this other gentleman, and the name will come to you, it's an unusual name, but his descendants eventually wrote in a book that they don't even think that his mother was an Indian at all, even though she claimed to be a Delaware. And then some tried to say, well, she wasn't a Delaware, but she was this other tribe. And then eventually, like I say, even the descendants said, no, we don't think she was at all. So he was a usurper under Lenape tradition, but he became the principal chief after Connor's brother passed. Connor was the next to last traditional chief, then his brother succeeding him, but his brother had issues, and I think including with alcoholism, and he passed, and then this guy was able to take power.
When did you do your investigation? Hold on just a second. We want to get your mics so the others can hear. Questions, comments, protest?
when did you do your dissertation?
I completed it in 2014, fall of 2014.
And that's when you were talking to the state of Texas, where they, were like not sure about things.
No, that would have been more around 2011 when I was still in grad school.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Tell them what you did your dissertation on.
On events in the 1930s, was kind of started in the late 20s, 1930s in East Texas town of San Augustine. That was basically overtaken by a local gang who built their power by exploiting the local black community, during the height of Jim Crow, who, by basically, robbing them, extorting them, scamming them, and so forth. And under Jim Crow culture, they didn't have any access to the courts. And but in the end, new rangers were sent in under James Allred that investigated those cases and brought them to court. And white juries convicted white men solely on the testimony of black victims and witnesses in 1935 and 36 in deep East Texas.
Okay, that sounds fascinating. We need him back just to talk about
I'm working on a second edition right now where I'm putting in a lot more of their testimony.
That's great stuff. We'll definitely have him back. Any questions, comments? That's fantastic. Really interested in that. Any questions, comments, protests? Myra has one? Okay. But before I take Myra's question, this gentleman represents the Seminole tribe, and he's also the first African-American Texas Ranger. And they always say that behind a great man, there's a great woman. And we have the blessing of having his wife here tonight. His name is Ranger Lee Young.
Where did John Connor die?
He died in Oklahoma, in the Bartlesville area. Yeah, that's where they ended up. Oh gosh, I think it was early '60s, but I don't recall right now. 1860s. Might have been a little later.
By the way, I think Colonel Dodge's name was Richard.
Richard, yes.
As I recall, there has been evidence of Delaware in Collin County.
Makes sense.
Not living as a permanent settlement, but in a nomadic way. We're talking about maybe finding an arrowhead or...
Yeah, they definitely had a village, I think somewhere south of here. That would be that absentee group. And they were broadly speaking, in the North Texas area. I don't remember exactly where. But they had a village. They got here in 1821, I believe.
As the tribes were being pushed out of the Northeast and Southeast, many of them came into Collin County. And they may not have been here very long, but there's evidence of numerous tribes, one of which was the Delaware. So you're saying they're what band of it?
They called them the absentee Delaware or the Texas Delaware. And that's the group that Jim Shaw was a part of.
And the one that Connor was part of went to Kansas and then eventually Oklahoma.
Correct.
Questions, comments, protests? This is we have an expert here, so this. Anything else? Okay, Paula, finally. See, my favorite part is the Q&A.
I'm sure you know where his land grant was.
It actually was split into two. It was Young County and Haskell County. There wasn't a league's worth of land to get, contiguous. Okay. By the time he patented in the I think it was 54, and so he had to split it up. And the one in Young County, it's not far from what's the name of that town? Graham. Yeah, it's not far from there, and it's they're on at least a part of it sets this ritzy resort kind of place, Wildcatter or something like that, it's that's where one part of it was.
Well, you mentioned undertold stories. You know the Texas Historical Commission does markers for undertold stories.
They
and that
supposedly,
sounds
I'm not
perfect.
sure what happened. They local people up there used my work and developed a marker text and applied for a marker. And I've been waiting to hear from them about the ceremony, so I don't know what the status is. Outside of Graham, yeah.
Oh, we'll have to check and see.
Yeah, but
Takes
the
a long
marker
time
was
to
actually
find.
going on the property of this Wildcatter resort place.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
The Young County has a lot of oil on it, so too bad his family didn't keep it.
Right.
This is the first time that we've been able to present a letter from Ebenezer Allen. And so you all got to see this is an inaugural event. Because when did you discover that?
Around 2011.
So well, as a matter of fact, Kevin took a picture of it.
Yeah.
And but the fact that he was willing to do that for an Indian says volumes about Ebenezer Allen.
Right. Yep. Yeah, as you can say, he was emphatic, and he carried a lot of weight.
Oh, yes.
He was a very prominent person at that time.
As I recall the story, when Ebenezer Allen came out of the Northeast, he came to Texas like 1835, 6, 7, somewhere in there. And quickly, Sam Houston noticed that he was highly educated. And most of those guys couldn't read and write. And he was, as they used to say, well learned. Any other last minute questions, comments, protests? Dr. Ginn, thank you so much. And he's got some books for sale over on the side. How much are they?
30 even.
Okay.
And so Ebenezer Allen,
Hold on just a second. Hold on.
I can talk louder. Ebenezer Allen, what role did he play in Texas? Wasn't he like Attorney General or something?
Right. Attorney General for, I think Tom was saying for the state, he was Attorney General he was Secretary of State during the Republic.
Okay, and then became Attorney General once it became part of the U.S. Mm-hmm. Okay.
He was the last Secretary of State for the Republic of Texas, and little we know about him is because he corresponded with the United States about the annexation of Texas into the United States. So we have examples of what he's written about the annexation. This is the first document I've seen written about something else.
Right.
So this is a real treasure.
Yeah, no, this is fantastic. Yeah, absolutely.
Especially for people who live in Allen, Texas. I mean, as I recall, just for the benefit of everybody, all we know about, I won't say all, but most of what we know about Ebenezer Allen is from correspondence with the United States. Probably there was more, but the state capitol burned down around 1880, and all the history of Ebenezer Allen went up in flames. So that's one reason we don't know that much. No, he never set foot in Allen, Texas. The Houston and Texas Central, he represented as a lawyer, not from as an attorney general, as a private lawyer. He represented the railroad, the early railroad, and so the railroad folks, who president of the railroad and so forth, they named all these towns around people that had associated with the railroad. Allen, Texas, for Ebenezer Allen. Anna and Van Alstyne and Melissa, I think Anna and Melissa were the daughters of the president of the Houston Central. So I guess when you're president of the company, you could name the cities for however you want to name. And then also, there's a city in Central Texas called Cossie, Texas. And Theodore Cossie was the surveyor who platted Allen, well, the first surveyor who platted Allen, Texas for the H&TC. So, you got your history lesson tonight. Dr. Ginn, thank you.